Boa tarde a todas y todos, ¿no? Para el Núcleo de Pesquisa en Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad de São Paulo, es una honra recibir a doctora Maísa Edwards. Maísa, ela possui um PhD de dupla titulação em Relações Internacionais pelo King's College e pela Universidade de São Paulo, especificamente pelo INE, ¿no? Sua pesquisa doutoral focou no Brasil, na zona de paz e cooperação do Atlântico Sul, ZOPACAS, do qual ela vai falar hoje, né? E na região do Atlântico Sul. Ela possui um mestrado, né, em Brasil, na perspectiva global, pelo King's College também, e um bacharelado em francês e espanhol pela University College of London, né? Maísa é poliglota. Além do português, né? A Maísa é professora e assistente de ensino de graduação e pós-graduação no King's College, pesquisadora no Departamento de História Militar da Universidade de Stellenbosch e, anteriormente, foi pesquisadora sênior de políticas no think tank República e no Lifelong Education Institute. Além disso, Maísa tem grande interesse em literatura multilingüe, não? Igual que eu, e multicultural. E desde fevereiro de 2021, gerencia o projeto Talk Books with Meet, ¿no? No Instagram, ¿no? Então, Maísa, seja muito bem-vinda, não?
Obrigada.
Muito obrigado por ter aceito o convite, não? E nós somos muito gratos aqui por sua presença.
Muito obrigada. Obrigada. Okay, hello everybody. Hi to people online as well. So as I was introduced by the fabulous Professor Rafael Villa, who I had the pleasure of being supervised by for my PhD. And thank you guys for being here. Thank you to those watching online, as I said. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to speak today about my research on the zone of peace and cooperation of the South Atlantic. More specifically today, speaking about the establishment of the zone of peace. I think this is where I had the opportunity on Wednesday to speak more generally about my research on the ZOPACAS, but today we're going back to the origins, which I think is particularly poignant and interesting to explore. So yeah, I think we'll dive right in. So giving a bit of context as well to me, as was already mentioned, I have a joint international relations PhD in international, as I said, a joint international relations PhD from King's and the University of São Paulo, which meant that I got to spend some time here about 5 years ago. I'm still remembering my way around campus. It's going all right, but could be better. And before that, made that transition from studying French and Spanish, so languages, into political science and international relations. So as you can see in the two pictures, one on one side is UCL, very majestic, very beautiful building, and King's College as well, which is absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, let's get cracking. So to give a sort of presentation overview, my presentation essentially analyzes the establishment process, which was led by Brazil, of the Zone of Peace and Cooperation in the South Atlantic. I also zone in on the empirical data, which I analysed for my PhD, including dispatches, telegrams, from the Itamaraty or Brazilian Foreign Ministry archives, as well as several many documents from the United Nations Digital Library. And this allowed me to not only provide a detailed consideration of the negotiations that led to the establishment of the zone, but also of the steps taken by Brazil to essentially establish the ZOPACAS, because when it comes to the creation or the establishment of a zone of peace, in this case, just like the one of the Indian Ocean, it goes through the United Nations General Assembly. And so being able to demonstrate then the manner in which Brazil kind of sought to establish its interests and how they were upheld, prior to and during the drafting of the commitments of the zone is also of interest, and it's something that I'll be looking at today as well. So to gain a sense as well of Brazil and how it kind of relates to the ZOPACAS, I think it's key to also map out the chronology of Brazil's membership from founding member to also a few considerations on the membership of Brazil now. And when we're thinking about the context of this recent return of the ZOPACAS, this new revitalization with Mindelo 2023, to the South Atlantic geopolitical stage, I think, as I mentioned, going back to the beginning and really kind of fleshing out what happened right at the beginning gives a good grounding for what the zone is now and how it can still continue in years to come. So a bit of an outline of my presentation, a little bit of an introduction. I'll then move into the first sort of part, which discusses the legacy of the Falkland-Malvinas War. I'm half Brazilian, half British after all, so I must be diplomatic if I say Falklands-Malvinas. And then moving into the actual establishment process of the ZOPACAS, thinking about, how it moved from a kind of concept to actually, a legitimate sort of entity, a zone of peace. We're then going to have a look at the formal inception of the zone of peace, thinking as well about the voting process, how it kind of came into existence, and then some conclusions. And then I'll finish with an overview of some key upcoming dates and as well a bit about my upcoming and ongoing research. So that's our little agenda, I guess. So when we're thinking then of what is the ZOPACAS, I feel like sometimes, there are various conversations around what is the ZOPACAS. And I have been able to demonstrate through my research that it truly is kind of what it says on the tin. I don't know if you guys have heard that expression, but it's very much what it says in its name. It's a maritime zone of peace, which was established on the 27th of October 1986 by the UN General Assembly. And this was very much largely through Brazilian efforts. Brazil not only was a champion of, peace building, thinking about what could be its presence in the South Atlantic, but it also wanted to kind of push for this creation of this zone of peace. And this is where the founding declaration, ARES 4111, would essentially kind of trigger the creation of this zone. And especially when we're thinking then of the South Atlantic region, one of the key things that I think is always key to also bear in mind is that the ZOPACAS is an example of South-South cooperation. We think so much about East-West or, North to South, but this is a truly South-South initiative. And when it comes to the membership, although 22 members were there right at the start, it is now composed of 24 member states. As we will see, 3 in South America and 21 in Africa. And essentially, when we're thinking then of the main objective of our presentation today, is to not only, as I said, look at the establishment process, but have an idea of what is Brazil's peace-building agenda in the South Atlantic. We think about how Brazil is blessed with this enormous coastline and just how critical it is, not only in its diplomatic relations, its defense relations, its economic relations. When it comes to Brazil and the South Atlantic, it's like 2 peas in a pod, right? So when we're thinking then of the member states, as I mentioned, and I hope that you guys online, just as those in this room can see the map well, there are 24 member states, as I mentioned, 3 in South America, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, and then 21 in Africa, from Cape Verde all the way down the west coast to South Africa. Since its inception, there have been 8 ministerial meetings. As I finished and submitted my thesis in December of 2022, the meeting in Mindelo, Cape Verde hadn't yet occurred. I remember speaking to Rafael when I found out the meeting would actually take place and thinking, oh my God, this is such a huge thing to think that the year I finished my PhD and defended in June, that after a period of 10 years, the ministerial meetings would resume. So that was very exciting. But the first was in Brazil, in Rio in '88, moving to Abuja, Nigeria in 1990, back to Brazil in 1994, Somerset West, South Africa in 1996, Buenos Aires 1998, Luanda, Angola 2007, Montevideo, Uruguay in 2013, and of course, as I mentioned, the one that happened a couple of years ago now in Cape Verde. One of the things, though, that I was able to showcase in my research was that there was actually a planned meeting in Cotonou, in Benin, in 2003. What happened was, when it came to organizing and planning this meeting, because the onus of actually coordinating the logistical and financial kind of organizational framework of these meetings falls to the host and to the host country. And so the reason why the meeting in Cotonou and Benin didn't take place was primarily due to logistical and financial difficulties, especially when we think about what was happening in West Africa around the early 2000s. We think of the civil war in Sierra Leone. There's a lot happening as well in the region. But that's just to give you guys a sort of framework as we look at the larger framework of the ZOPACAS before we start re-diving into the beginning. So when it comes to my actual analysis, as I mentioned, I began by considering the legacy and the various impacts of Falklands Malvinas War, which was, as you know, in 1982, so only 4 years before the establishment of the ZOPACAS. So this, of course, as we know, it was a war of short duration between the UK and Argentina, but it was also critical in shaping the South Atlantic security nexus, especially because after the war, the British decided to reinvest in security. They stationed more troops. They built the Mount Pleasant Air Base. So they were already beginning to kind of militarize the South Atlantic in that regard as well. And so when we're thinking then about evaluations of the establishment of the ZOPACAS, we also need to think about the peace and security and cooperation nexus of the time. You know, when you think of the member states, you know, all littoral countries or coastal countries wanting to come together, it makes sense in a lot of ways that they would not only want to be able to consolidate their interests, but to position themselves in a way that they would be able to find support and mutual assurance in a lot of ways amongst each other. So when it comes to those empirical data, that when I was conducting my research, of course, it made sense to go to the source of Brazil's kind of diplomatic kind of architecture. So going to the Itamaraty, going through all the paper documents, going through the digital documents that I was allowed access to. I'll mention a little bit about that later. But when it comes to going through the Itamaraty archives, there was truly a treasure trove, you know, boxes upon boxes upon boxes. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go to the Itamaraty archives at the beginning of March 2020, so just before the pandemic. So fortunately was able to get that data set before I had to, you know, obviously I went back to the UK. So when it comes to the documents from the UN Digital Library, you can also get a sense of just how much there is in terms of declarations, resolutions, letters, all there in the originals, and you know, be it in French or in Spanish or in English. And that's something that I was very keen to do, is to actually look at and read the originals. So as Professor Rafael kindly mentioned, you know, I'm somebody who not only really enjoys languages, but I use languages actively in my research. So being able to read the originals was very important to me, especially when you think about the importance of, you know, a synonym here or the way in which something is framed. That could also change the understanding of the text. So this is a little exemplar of the top of the Declaration of the Zone of Peace and Cooperation South Atlantic. As you can see, the download stamp is in 2018, so the year I started my PhD. I remember the first time I read the founding declaration, getting a sense of, you know, what is truly then the ZOPACAS, what is it trying to do? And this is where, when it comes to the zone itself, you know, when you look at those the preambulatory clauses and the operative clauses, you get a sense of just how much the ZOPACAS not only is quite unique in what it seeks to do with promoting peace, promoting cooperation, but being very much, you know, against the militarization of the South Atlantic, wanting to remove the influence of nuclear powers, you know, being very against the apartheid regime in South Africa. This is explicitly mentioned. So when you see what the zone was trying to achieve from the start, I think that it is a true example not only of countries in the South banding together, but those who are seeking to promote peace in essentially, of course, the final decade of the Cold War. So when it comes then to the legacy of the Falklands-Malvinas War, this is just a little bit of preamble. I think we all know this, but it's where it is. Well, it's an archipelago which is a lot closer to the South American mainland than it is from the UK, but it is still obviously officially, at least in designations, a British overseas territory. But the island's sovereignty has, of course, long been challenged by Argentina. Ignacio, who's a colleague, and I have had many chats about this, which has always been fun. But the Falklands-Malvinas War was actually, obviously a dispute that didn't sort of happen in a vacuum. It's something that kind of emerged through many years of tensions, but it really kind of came to a head, of course, in 1982 under the Argentine military government. And so with the invasion, which was the subject of the UN Security Council Resolution 502, it called, of course, for the governments of Argentina and the UK to refrain from the use of threat or force in the region of Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas. And I think that's also a very interesting thing, because it shows, just like I am diplomatic and I say Falklands Malvinas, you also see clearly in even UN documentation that there is an acknowledgement that there are the two sides. And I think that's really important as well. So although, of course, the war was of short duration, lasting from April until June, its regional impact, I argue, cannot be underestimated. Not only can we see the kind of divisions and imbalances between the global north and the global south, particularly regarding military strength. Remember, I said right at the beginning about the building of the Mount Pleasant Air Force, but the fact that the British sent, task force over 8,000 miles to reclaim the islands. And when it comes to the legacy of the war, one of the things that I've been able to demonstrate in my research is its legacy in influencing the causes laid out in the founding declaration, and also the actual kind of impetus as well, in many ways, for the establishment of a zone of peace in the South Atlantic. And so this is where the year in which this resolution of 3716 came out, so this is only a few months after the Falklands-Malvinas War in 1982, there is explicit determination that 1986 would be declared the International Year of Peace. So I think that's quite important, because you think of the way in which the ZOPACAS would be established, 4 years later. It was established within a clear framing by the United Nations that this would be a year of international peace. And so when it comes to actually considering what is the ZOPACAS, credit where credit's due, of course, always, the concept was developed by the Brazilian academic and diplomat José Viegas Filho in his doctoral thesis in 1982. And this was where the development of what were the seeds, really, that would become the ZOPACAS were being developed really in the face of a proposed OTAS or SATO, which would have included a sort of similar framework to what is NATO, but would have included South Africa. And I think this is very interesting, because over the years, people say to me, oh, Maísa, is the ZOPACAS like NATO? No, it isn't. It's very different from NATO. And what had been proposed as something similar, or a SATO, was actually rejected by Brazil. Brazil did not want a SATO or an OTAS, or whichever one of the two acronyms that you prefer, because it precisely involved defense cooperation between countries in the South Atlantic, as well as apartheid era South Africa. And because the ZOPACAS is very much a union of countries that do not possess nuclear weapons, who are very much anti-nuclear, apartheid era South Africa, as we know, possessed nuclear weapons. So that disqualified it from being envisaged as a potential member. But also, of course, as I mentioned before, the apartheid regime is explicitly mentioned as a threat to peace. And also there'd been an idea of a South Atlantic Pact or something along those lines as well, but that was also rejected by Brazil. They didn't want that. So when it comes to the inclusion of an item in the provisional agenda of the 41st session at the UN for the Zone of Peace and Cooperation, which I always think is a sign many years ago in the universe that I needed to study this, because this letter was sent on my birthday, the 29th of May. I don't know, believe what you like about cosmic kind of weirdness, but I did have a slight startle kind of when I was like, oh, the letter to actually introduce this concept to the UN happened on the 29th of May. I mean, I wasn't born in 86, I was born in 92, but interesting coincidence. So this is where you see Brazilian Foreign Minister Sodré actually proposing the creation of the zone. And this, of course, is 1 year after, as we know, the end of the Brazilian military dictatorship. So the kind of time is of the essence, really, when we're thinking about Brazil transitioning out of dictatorship to democracy, and also this consolidation of the seeking to achieve peace and promote peace. So here are just a couple of quotes that I pulled out from some UN documents that I looked at, mostly concerned with how we can understand the South Atlantic region. And this is where it really kind of lays it out as a region with an identity of its own, one that, you know, we're thinking about this relation between Latin America and Africa. As we know, continents or regions that have very shared sort of historical groundings, similar problems and interests regarding, as I mentioned, you know, on the slide from the quotation, economic development, social welfare, and peace. And so this is where they really acknowledge how this is a climate that's conducive to understanding and cooperation. So it's essentially demonstrating that these regions are well suited for this kind of initiative. And also, when it comes to this idea of the declaration of the ZOPACAS, you know, it really zones in once again that real tie towards non-nuclearization, because it says very clearly, you know, that it's a logical follow-up. You know, think about that language, a logical follow-up to initiatives such as the Treaty of Tlatelolco on the prohibition of nuclear weapons in Latin America, and also what would later be as well the Treaty of Pelambaba, right, in '96. So this is where we can have this grounding of what was the circumstance around when the ZOPACAS was established. So a couple of other kind of interesting quotes that I wanted to pull out. This is from one of the documents I found in the Itamaraty. This was translated by me. I did all my own translations from the original Portuguese into English. I wanted to be, of course, as accurate as possible, and I believe that I did the best I could. So this is where, when it comes to the planned establishment of the ZOPACAS, especially internally in the Itamaraty, I think it's very interesting how it says it responds to that long-standing concern of Brazilian diplomacy regarding the preservation of the South Atlantic. You know, again, highlighting the importance of Brazil to the ocean. Remember what we said right at the beginning, you know, coming together, you know, the Brazil, the South Atlantic through trade, through defense, but also when we're thinking of how there are these key issues of political questions such as the sovereignty of Angola, independent process of Namibia, as well as these other kind of issues as well. So we can see how, when it comes to the framing of the South Atlantic for Brazil, it is, of course, of critical importance. But it also highlights how Namibia, as we know, was under occupation by South Africa. We know that there is a lot to be said as well about the way in which, so Angola, of course, had become independent, but it was still dealing with civil war. So it was kind of this grounding of what was the South Atlantic at the time. Another quote as well that I thought was interesting when it comes to the analysis that I've done for this section is the view again of this specific identity. And this is where, again, when we're thinking of that South-South cooperation, this idea of a shared identity is very interesting. This Afro-Latin American character. And again, this sense of wanting to promote not only regional cooperation, but pushing the concept of peace to be a responsibility of the states. And this is, again, where it's really kind of highlighting what I said before about how the illegitimate interests of the South African apartheid regime are excluded. So Brazil was very committed to not having apartheid-era South Africa anywhere near a proposed ZOPACAS at its inception, but also not wanting to kind of have them be involved in any sort of South-South cooperation existing at that time. When it comes to Sarney, of course, the post-military dictatorship president of Brazil, he, from what I could find, was very much actively seeking to discuss the importance of the South Atlantic, as well as Brazil's firm stance against the non-proliferation, the firm stance regarding the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and disarmament. So when I had a look at both the documents in the UN, but also at the Itamaraty, I was able to find concrete proof of this. And again, when he has these meetings with heads of state, you know, he has meetings with representatives from Argentina and Uruguay and Cape Verde. So it really shows how much Brazil was cooperating with these other countries at the establishment of the ZOPACAS. It wasn't, okay, yes, Brazil was its champion from the start, and it has and continues to be its leading member, but without the support of other member states or even conversations with other member states, you know, the ZOPACAS wouldn't have evolved the way it has. And I think that needs to be recognized more and more. When it comes as well to an assessment of the region, of course, we have to think about the US, the UK, and France. The US has long viewed Latin America and South America as its own backyard. It sees the South Atlantic very much as, part of a wider Atlantic Ocean, which is very different, of course, from how we in Brazil see it. There's a distinction between the North and the South. And the UK and France, of course, having these long-standing colonial legacies in the region as well. So this is when we're thinking about an assessment of countries that were perceived as likely having an issue or problem with the establishment of ZOPACAS, those are the three that I was able to identify that were seen as potentially maybe going to make anything difficult. So when it comes then to the draft of the ZOPACAS declaration, I was able to kind of find all the steps, which was pretty amazing. You can see that the draft was put forward by Angola, Argentina, Brazil, Cape Verde, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Nigeria, São Tomé and Príncipe, and Uruguay. So again, this unity of countries seeking to achieve a common goal. And so the countries would, of course, would soon become ZOPACAS member states, with those countries included, Angola, Argentina, Brazil, Nigeria, and Uruguay, all, of course, later playing host to ministerial meetings. So this again demonstrates how countries that would later host were also still very much involved from the start. And when it comes to the voting record of the zone, it passed with 124 members voting in favour, including actually the UK. So the UK surprised Brazil in that sense. It voted in favour of the creation of the ZOPACAS, the Soviet Union. So of course we think of the Cold War, that sort of bipolarness of US versus USSR, but the Soviet Union voted in favour. And of course, all the future members of the ZOPACAS did as well. When it comes to those that actually abstained from voting, I guess no surprises. You can see that many are former colonial powers. So France is there, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Japan. They abstained from the voting. So several NATO and influential members that are also former colonial powers, they were very much perceived as protecting their interests, right? So you think about the challenges and tensions of the Cold War period, and even though, of course, their former colonies were now independent, you still see that these countries, especially France, were still seeking to kind of protect their interests at the time. So the US, again, I guess in many ways, no surprises, was the only country actually to take everything a sort of step further. They were the only country to vote against the establishment of the ZOPACAS. So when it comes to the US's perception, one thing that I was able to demonstrate is how at the beginning they kept voting no, 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 until it got to a point in the 90s where they started abstaining, but they don't vote in favor. And it's again that sense of why. I was able to demonstrate the reason why the US keeps voting against, not only, of course, because of its own interests, but because it saw the ZOPACAS as potentially a threat to the way in which UNCLOS, so the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea, was going to be applied in the South Atlantic. And they thought that there'd be challenges when it comes to the regulation of the high seas. And they also had an issue with Angola. So we already know the US actually supported UNITA and everything else that went on when it comes to Angolan independence and the latest civil war. So the US kind of explicitly names its challenges for the zone in documents like that as well, which was very interesting. And so moving now, I guess, on to some conclusions. The ZOPACAS was established a year and 7 months after the end of the Brazilian military dictatorship. So that shows that, not only was Brazil making this transition from military rule, but to civilian rule, but was also thinking about its place in the world, how it would situate itself, what kind of new diplomatic relations would be constructed. Notwithstanding, thinking about what is the importance of South-South-led peace-building initiatives, and also securing that sense of regional peace, which would be very important. In the 1990s, we see that expansion of the zone's membership, so from 22 to 24, which is where it is today, with the inclusion of Namibia following its independence from South Africa, and then South Africa upon the dismantlement of its nuclear weapons program and the end of apartheid. So one of the things that I could really also show is that, of course, it was very much grounded in the literature. I just feel like with my research, I took it a lot further to show, again, just how Brazil was significant in the establishment of the ZOPACAS and also incentivizing the UN to establish the zone. But it also, was able to start, because of its very early involvement in its drafting of the declaration, in its meeting with the heads of state, it was able to start really to develop its influence in the nascent ZOPACAS in a way that it does still to this day. So I think that this is where some key conclusions. So yeah, I guess when it comes to moving, into the final part of my presentation, thinking about a timeline as well of my sort of key upcoming dates and upcoming research. So as Professor Rafael mentioned, I'm a lecturer and graduate teaching assistant at King's. I teach on modules such as diplomacy and foreign policy, CPAT, empires and strategy, and global Cold War, so very much within my areas of research, which has been really fun. Since November, I'm also a research fellow in military history at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. And I'm really just trying to continue my research on the ZOPACAS and collaborate with other academics on this topic, because not only do I feel like with this new revitalization, and the threats to peace that we can see with piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, we can see, of course, that China is still very present in the South Atlantic, consistently, expanding its reach. What with our considerations, what will happen in the future with the Antarctic. I think this is a very interesting time right now to think about maritime security. I'm also, alongside this, involved with some funded research for the Circle U European University Alliance, as well as working on a project on the Alcora exercise. I'm sure you probably know what it is, but the Alcora exercise was a political alliance, and also in a lot of ways military alliance between Portugal, what was apartheid era South Africa, and what was Rhodesia in the 1970s. And I'm doing this project with colleagues from Stellenbosch, Lancaster, and from Glasgow. Whilst here in Brazil, I am having a little bit of holiday, but so far it's been predominantly doing these very amazing guest lectures, of which I've now done 4, this will be the 4th, in May and June. So at USP, Unifesp in FECAPI, and then I'll be at FGV in Rio on the 10th of June, also speaking about my research. And also just continuing to do, I think, what we all do as academics, which is to send and submit and publish research in academic journals. I'm almost finished writing my book proposal as well to turn my thesis into a book. And I also want to kind of give a bit more time to some other interests. So as was mentioned, I've always been very passionate about languages and multilingualism and multicultural literature. So I have this project, Talk Books with Me. If you're interested and would like to follow, it's at talk_books_with me. And it's very much a platform where I want to introduce followers to books by authors in different languages, particularly shining a light on authors from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And very much because I think that storytelling and reading not only help shape identity, but they facilitate communication. And the more that we can do as human beings to kind of bridge those cultural gaps, I think not only do we foster greater empathy, but we also develop our own cognizance of how we see, read, and understand the world. So that's kind of what I've been doing and what I'm going to be doing. And here are some upcoming publications as well. There's 2 in the works, one that will hopefully be coming out next month. So that's my article, which is in peer review at the moment for the Specialist Journal of the Columbian War College, which is essentially on the effects of the Falklands-Malvinas War on Anglo-Brazilian diplomatic and defense relations between 1982 and 1985. And then a paper that I co-wrote with Rodrigo Pedraza Lira, who's also was here at USP, who did the PhD with me on multilateralism. And then those are the 3 articles that I have already. So if you want to read a bit more or have any questions, let me know. And that's it. I just want to say thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed. I wanted to be as detailed as possible, but also conscientious of time. But I hope you enjoyed. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maísa, for your great and powerful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Paul, the question, las preguntas pueden ser feitas
en portugués o inglés, como vocês
¿no?
preferirem. Não tem problema nenhum.
Eu tenho 2 perguntas.
Claro, por favor.
Primeiro, queria agradecer pela apresentação e minhas perguntas, uma é sobre o seguinte. Há uma literatura nas últimas décadas aqui no Brasil que começa a olhar de forma crítica essa ideia de cooperação sul-sul.
Sim.
Na ideia de que esse movimento de aproximar os países do Sul contra uma contraposição a uma cooperação norte-sul, que seria, no fundo, uma instrumentalização de dominação, muitos começaram a perceber que o Brasil, e aí tem aquela coisa tradicional de olhar o Brasil como um Estado imperialista na América do Sul, mas começaram a perceber que várias cooperações sul-sul, o Brasil instrumentalizava essa cooperação no sentido de projetar o seu poder de dominação. Eu queria saber se nas ZOPACAS isso você chegou a perceber ou não, seria essa a primeira pergunta. E a segunda pergunta diz respeito a isso que você mencionou sobre a questão de uma identidade sul-atlanticana, digamos assim, mas muito pela questão latino-americana com o histórico africano na região. E aí, aqui no Brasil, a gente tem muito essa, pelo menos desde o governo Dilma, uma discrepância muito forte em política externa dos partidos ligados a alas de direita e partidos ligados à área de esquerda. Com partidos de esquerda muito próximos a uma aventura latino-americana, digamos assim, e os partidos de direita tendo uma visão muito restrita sobre a América Latina e, obviamente, o passado africano, cultural africano na região. Eu queria saber se essa clivagem política, ideológica, afetou de alguma maneira o processo das ZOPACAS.
Você se importaria se eu respondesse em inglês?
Pode responder em inglês.
Obrigada. Eu acho que é só porque eu passo quase a maior parte do meu tempo pensando em todos esses termos super pertinentes em inglês, eu ainda estou me treinando a responder uma das coisas um pouco mais nítidas em português. So to answer, I guess, your first question, when it comes to Brazil's role in the ZOPACAS, this is something that, as I explained, has been present ever since the beginning. Brazil is still the biggest champion of the zone. I don't know if you guys had a chance to read the paper that was published in 2023 about when defense meets foreign policy, the kind of militarization of the ZOPACAS, where the Brazilian Navy in particular has been a key instrument in the revitalization of the ZOPACAS. So I think that when it comes to Brazil's role, it's multifaceted. It's a continuation of the values that the zone was established with, of peace and cooperation. But Brazil really is, in a lot of ways, the glue that holds a lot of this together. So, for example, in the ministerial meeting in Montevideo in Uruguay, Brazil was responsible for bringing quite a few, or helping bring quite a few of the African delegates to Uruguay. So that means that Brazil, was facilitating their involvement. When it comes to Brazil's positioning, at least from what I have seen and what I've read and what I've discussed with friends and colleagues in the Brazilian Navy, I think that because the ZOPACAS is still this sort of flexible entity, you have these ministerial meetings, but you have these periods of dormancy. Brazil, in a lot of ways, has been very busy, in the last 20 years with BRICS, with Mercosur, with other cooperative entities. So I think that this is where the ZOPACAS, although I believe it's important, I think it has a key role to play still when it comes to South Atlantic security. I think, in all honesty, when it comes to Brazil's kind of role in international kind of groups or forums, I think that it consolidates its efforts a lot more in other groups than it does necessarily even with the ZOPACAS. It's important and it does stay the ZOPACAS, but I wouldn't say that the ZOPACAS is still like a top priority in the way I think it could be, or leveraged in that way. And then with your second question, I think that when we're considering the way in which this positioning of left and right and how Brazil has positioned itself, I think that with the return of Lula, especially to government, we see this return of multilateralism coming to the forefront. We had the revitalization in 2023. So when it comes to the push forward for the zone, I hope that, regardless of who becomes our next president, I think that the grounding for this revitalization, because it's being steered by the Navy, is still in existence. And I think that when we're thinking of the way in which the kind of global climate is right now, especially when it comes to South American, African relations, we can see that also in other avenues. You can think of like Ipsamar, for example, the fact that India, is kind of being also kind of shown as this big partner. India, of course, has a lot of interest in the Indo-Pacific. Brazil has a lot of interest in the South Atlantic. So I think that when it comes to how we see the future of the region, I think Brazil will steer it. I think it needs to be in cooperation. So Nigeria, South Africa, Angola are going to be key players as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What can I do? The chat.
Eu posso... Então, eu vou pegar uma pergunta enquanto isso.
Claro.
Obrigado pela apresentação.
Uhum.
Em primeiro lugar, que você apontou que você fez uma análise bem da linguagem, de forma utilizada, a linguagem dos documentos. Ouvi um pouco, você começou a mencionar do colonialismo, como está presente esse tema nesse debate, mas também queria ouvir sobre se há alguma coisa quanto a recursos naturais, principalmente naquela região. Proteção de recursos naturais, o meio ambiente, naquele período incipiente de agenda ambiental da década de 80, começo da década de 90, assim, com problemas que tem muitas vezes com o Japão de fazendo pesca naquela região, a questão da pesca de vários países ali, de que forma isso está presente, se está presente, se não está presente na agenda das opacas. E quanto a questão do Reino Unido ter apoiado a criação das opacas de forma surpreendente, se talvez tenha sido uma estratégia como constraint da Argentina, tipo, se a interpretação do Reino Unido foi uma coisa assim de encarar como um fator que não levaria a Argentina a ter outras incursões militares, qual que foi a interpretação talvez do Reino Unido a respeito disso?
Legal, obrigada pela pergunta. Posso também responder em inglês? É onde, so when it comes to, I guess that first kind of conditioning of the environment, the importance of regional security. This is something that I'm actually currently working on with a colleague at King's, with Clement, who's amazing. He's in the African Leadership Centre. He and I are co-writing a piece right now on climate security and ZOPACAS. So I think that this is where, you know, it is a very pertinent kind of way of approaching, especially when it comes to the South Atlantic and the vulnerabilities that it faces. When it comes to the true kind of inception of the ZOPACAS, when it comes to the identified threats to peace, I think they're a lot more human, kind of political. So when it comes to even the understanding of the climate, I feel like although they acknowledge that, you know, it's of course it's a maritime space, it's a very important space in terms of resources. I think that climate, you know, in the 80s, it wasn't perceived in the same way it was, say, 10 years later. But I can say that the meeting that happened in Montevideo in Cape Verde in 2023, you know, really brought the issue of climate back to the forefront, because obviously Cape Verde, being an island nation, is a lot more affected in a lot of ways by climate change. So when it comes to the progression of the ZOPACAS, one of the things that Clement and I are going to argue in this paper is just how much the ZOPACAS can still be a way of promoting the shared interests, and that should include more on climate. And then with regard to the second question, I think this is where, when it comes to the positioning of the UK, and in the year I finished my PhD, I was invited on 3 occasions actually to speak to delegates. I spoke to the senior desk officer for Africa at the Ministry of Defence. I spoke to the head of the political section of the Brazilian embassy, and I spoke to representatives from the US embassy here in Brasilia. And one of the things that the British were really interested about is not only how Brazil positions itself in the South Atlantic, but how the British, it was a kind of keenness to demonstrate how much the British have been keen allies, of course, and supporters of Brazil. You know, we can think about the relationship between the British, or the Royal Navy and the Brazilian Navy from, you know, when the Portuguese came over, right, from Portugal. This is, you know, Lord Cochrane and all of that. So I think that when it comes to the British and their positioning with the ZOPACAS, I think that the fact that they agreed and voted yes is a very promising step. And when it comes to the way in which they view South Atlantic security, you know, for the British, they are regional powers. For others, they are extra-regional powers. So it's, for them, it's still very keen interest what happens in the South Atlantic, of course, because they've got Ascension, St. Helena, Tristan da Cunha, you know, the Falklands, South Sandwich, South Georgia, etc. Plus, you know, we also have to think about the Antarctic. You know, the areas of Argentine and British interest overlap. And this is where I feel like in the next 20 years, as we see the time ticking on the Antarctic Treaty, we need to think more and more how we're going to reconfigure the sense of South Atlantic security. Because any kind of challenge or issue is going to need to be discussed by regional powers, but it's too important for it to be ignored by those that are hundreds and hundreds of miles away. You know, the fact that China starts seeing itself as a near Arctic state already shows that this is already happening, this issue of security and how countries position themselves. And that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Eu queria saber como os países das ZOPACAS reagiram à reativação da quarta frota dos Estados Unidos, porque pelo menos na América do Sul, na Unasul, isso foi muito discutido.
Sim.
O Lula, o Celso Amorim, sempre ligavam a questão da quarta frota com os recursos naturais. Eu queria saber como isso ressoou entre os países das ZOPACAS.
Obrigada pela pergunta. Essa eu acho que eu posso também responder em português, porque é algo que eu estava falando a respeito nem 2 dias atrás com um amigo. Quando se pensa a posição dos Estados Unidos, como é visto, claro, como um grande aliado e também um parceiro, em muitas maneiras, pelo Brasil, pelos outros países na região, eu acho que qualquer movimento que os Estados Unidos faz vai, claro, ressonar e ter muita importância. Porém, ainda assim, é um ator não regional. Então, qualquer decisão que os Estados Unidos fizer, eu acho que ainda é visto um pouco com cautela. Então, quando se pensa a quarta frota, como os Estados Unidos, como eu falei no início da apresentação, vê o Atlântico como um todo, não é norte-sul, é um todo. Para eles era uma continuação aos interesses dele. Então, para nós, como brasileiros ou como países no Atlântico Sul, é visto mais como essa ideia de é uma mudança em alguma maneira de posicionamento. Mas para eles é o Atlântico Sul, é o Atlântico, é tudo debaixo da mesma sombrinha. Então, eu acho que quando a gente pensa ameaças à paz, e o capitão João Noritomo, que é um grande amigo meu com quem estou escrevendo um paper sobre threats to peace e tudo mais, a gente tem conversado muito a respeito desse posicionamento do Brasil e os outros Estados-membros, pensando sobre o Reino Unido, Estados Unidos, China, Rússia, França, onde tem vários atores que estão presentes. Mas para os Estados Unidos, como já se vê como um país muito forte dentro desse posicionamento do Atlântico e também na grande América Latina, para os Estados Unidos é aquela continuação daquele own backyard. Então, eu acho que qualquer movimentação, ainda mais com o Trump na presidência, temos que ver com bastante cautela. E continuar também advocando que a gente sempre tem dito que tem essa divisão. Tem o norte e tem o sul. O norte é a OTAN, o sul é as ZOPACAS. Espero que isso responda a pergunta.
Maísa, queria te perguntar o seguinte, não? Enquanto agenda de pesquisa, ¿no? En cuanto tema académico, lá na Inglaterra, ¿no? Y levando en cuenta que Inglaterra tem muitos interesses no Atlântico Sul, né?
Sim, com certeza.
Bom, mas o que Falcão, mas tá aí, né? Há interesse de pesquisar essas temáticas, não? Lá na Inglaterra, não? Por lá, o World Studies, outros departamentos, o próprio Brazilian Center.
Sim, então, é onde, com a minha pesquisa, como é algo que, assim, o Atlântico Sul é algo que eu pesquiso desde o mestrado. Eu escrevi a minha tese sobre relações anglo-brasileiras depois da Guerra das Malvinas. Então, eu já comecei a pensar muito nesse tema do Atlântico Sul. Mas eu tenho maravilhosos colegas que também pensam em Atlântico Sul, que pensam em segurança norte-americana, ainda mais no World Studies. O meu outro orientador com você, o Vinícius, é uma pessoa que pesquisa muito esse tema, e pesquisa de uma maneira fantástica. Então, eu acho que, em termos de interesse no King's, existe com certeza, somos um bom grupo. Quando se pensa esses temas no Reino Unido, continua, é onde, como você falou, os interesses do Reino Unido vão continuar sempre no Atlântico Sul, porque para o Reino Unido é um interesse para eles regional, porque, no final das contas, o Reino Unido tem essa presença. E, nos olhos do Reino Unido, é um British Overseas Territory, não pertence. E eu acho que, quando a gente tem que pensar no futuro do Atlântico Sul, ainda mais, como eu mencionei, sobre o que a gente tem que pensar com a Antártida, temos que seguir numa maneira cooperativa. É onde os mais países que têm esse interesse têm que continuar se falando em total.
Mas tem uma pergunta aqui,
Sim.
eu vou colocar na tela, não sei se você consegue ler,
Claro.
mas diz o seguinte: minha principal dúvida é quanto à relevância das ZOPACAS como instrumento de diplomacia sul-sul no cenário geopolítico atual. Quais são os principais desafios do dia de hoje?
Quer tá perguntar?
É o LIP. É possível esperar uma necessidade de reinvenção para os anos seguintes? E aí ele colocou que pode responder no idioma que você preferir.
Obrigada, super aprecio. Se tudo bem, essa eu vou responder também em inglês. When it comes to thinking about threats to peace and present challenges, as I mentioned before, the South Atlantic is particularly active right now. We have to think about, threats to peace through piracy, the trafficking of small arms, of drugs. There's cyber kind of contentions as well. So when it comes to the relevance of the ZOPACAS as an instrument of South-South diplomacy, I think that we can really see it as an instrument that should have more, there should be a greater motor behind it, because it can be used in so many different ways. And because of its more kind of flexible structure, it's not an organization, it's not an institution, it's a zone of peace. It doesn't have a headquarters, it doesn't have a fixed budget. And through its flexibility, to me, that provides this sort of way in which it can be adapted to fit the most pressing issues and also bring more countries in the region to the table. So when it comes to your second part of your question, when it comes to this reinvention or uma necessidade de reinvenção para os anos seguintes, this revitalization as such, we saw it in the meeting in Cape Verde in 2023, but there is, from what I've heard, there is a sense that there will be a 9th meeting in Brazil potentially next year. We will see if it happens. I'll be delighted, of course, if it does. But the fact that, for example, I went to an event at King's, which was done by a vice admiral, and he mentioned the ZOPACAS explicitly in his presentation, I think that is encouraging to know that there are people and researchers within the Navy who are not only continuing that interest and also steering a lot of the kind of Brazilian contingency towards thinking about the ZOPACAS, but I think it shows that there is that perception that there are very real threats to peace, and this needs to be discussed in a way that is both inclusive and brings everyone to the table. Hope that answers your question. Obrigada pela pergunta.
Só para complementar aquela pergunta, o que no Brasil, né? Não tem muita tradição de estudo, mesmo sobre o Atlântico Sul em geral, não? Há dificuldades, não? Geopolíticos do passado tinham, né? muita, mas eu lembro, embora a contexto internacional, você conhece esse número, esse fecha isso, então, não tinha um orientando de doutorado, não? Cuyo temática era foi o Atlântico Sul, ele se doutorou nisso, não? Mas ele entrou em crise, não? Faltando como 10 meses para finalizar a tese, não? Porque a questão dele era se o Atlântico Sul era uma temática que lhe permitisse alguma inserção de mercado, não? Entende? Que uma questão, eu mesmo que estou dizendo aqui, não? Que o Atlântico Sul é uma temática fundamental, não? Entende? Que hoje são os únicos aqui que no Brasil que tentam capitalizar é a Marinha, não? Com a questão da Amazônia Sul, não? O discurso da Sul. Mas é uma temática fundamental.
Sim,
temática fundamental que precisa ser resgatada aqui, não? no Brasil, mas que na Inglaterra, pelo que você me disse, não? Existe mais tradição, não?
Sim, é um tema.
Está na
mas,
agenda.
Sim, é onde ainda mais quando a gente pensa do Atlântico, aí como um todo, meio visão Globo Norte, mas como um todo, eu acho que existe e sempre existirá interesse. Eu acho que a necessidade agora é de continuar a enfatizar que existe essa divisão entre o Norte e o Sul. Da mesma maneira que as pessoas às vezes falam sobre Indo-Pacífico como um todo, tem que se ainda pensar no que é as áreas de estratégia e de interesse também.
Mas tem alguma outra...
Tudo certo?
Maísa, muitíssimo obrigado. Aliás, você pensa publicar isso, sua pesquisa?
Sim, meu artigo já está quase pronto. É um daqueles 3 artigos que eu mencionei para você outro dia, que são 98% prontos. Você precisa terminar de formatar, fazer meu check-in e tudo mais.
Você precisa publicar um livro?
Sim, gostaria. É onde eu estou tirando as partes em artigo primeiro, porque tem que ser conteúdo original. Aí eu vou ver em termos uma Springer, uma Palgrave, uma Routledge, alguma coisa assim. Ou talvez tentar uma University Press, para ver o que rola depois.
Muitíssimo obrigado, Maísa.
Obrigada a vocês. Thank you, everybody. Obrigada.
E volte sempre.
Obrigada.